I have a fairly long history working in the Canadian Arctic, going back over 30 years. I was originally a PhD student and did my thesis on wild polar bears in the Arctic. And following graduation, I went to work for the government of the Northwest Territories as a polar bear biologist, and later on we became part of the government of Nunavut. And eventually moved into a position as a wildlife manager, the director of wildlife management for the government of Nunavut, and in its early years as a government, and then eventually went on to train as a veterinarian, and at the same time maintained a consulting practice doing wildlife conservation, wildlife research. Primarily polar bears, but other species as well, working with environmental assessments to do with caribou and wolves and wolverines and all sorts of wildlife. So my entire career has been focused very much on Arctic wildlife, primarily, as I said, in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. But during that time, I've had great pleasure to interact with people from all over the Canadian Arctic in different regions. Northern Quebec, Nunavik, and the Nunatsiavut region in the west, and the Nunatsiavut as well. I was trained as a scientist, as a biologist, and when I first came to the north, certainly when I first came to work for government in the north, one of the tasks that was given to me, in addition to conducting polar bear research, was that I was given, on one occasion, my very first instance, I was up in the high Arctic in a place called Lancaster Sound, and we were doing a polar bear survey up there, and I was asked to go in on my days off when the weather was too bad to go and collect some traditional knowledge on polar bears in the region that we would use to sort of try to complement the study that we were doing. I was the young, newly graduated biologist, and I first sat down and created a questionnaire of the things that I thought would be useful to ask, and thought that this questionnaire might take me about half hour, 45 minutes to sort of sit down with people and go through. So I went down to Resolute, down to town, and went to the Hunters and Trappers organization and found out the names of some individuals, some elders and experienced hunters who the HTO thought would be good for me to talk to, and proceeded to go door to door with this questionnaire. And I think after the first or second sit down or second house, I realized quite quickly that it was a 45-minute questionnaire was really not that useful, and it wasn't 45 minutes. Every time I asked a question, I thought I was expecting a very simple sort of survey-style answer, but I ended up with receiving much more information than that. Numerous stories and observations and all sorts of things, and it suddenly dawned on me that this style of questioning was really not useful at all. That there was so much more to this body of knowledge that was not being tapped into. It also made me realize that the knowledge that was being shared was, in many ways, the concepts that were being put forward were very similar to, or the same as, the concepts that we held in science in terms of population dynamics of polar bears, but they were just held from a slightly different perspective. An example was I was talking about the harvesting of polar bears and the concept of sustainable harvesting, and somebody said to me the idea that in order to harvest, in order for a population to be sustainable, that it needed to be harvested, and by harvesting it, you would make the population healthier and more productive. And one of the phrases was, if you harvest polar bears in this area, more polar bears will come. And initially I thought, well, that's a bit strange. And then I started to think about it and realized that in population dynamics, we have the same sort of theories, which is that a polar bear population is at its most productive when it is being harvested at a certain level. And that when polar bears are not subject to sort of harvest pressure or mortality pressure, they can get into their populations can increase to a point where they start to regulate themselves through what we call density dependence. In other words, you end up with too many polar bears in a certain area and not enough resources for each polar bear. Consequently, the population will then go down. You'll start to see a reduction in the number of cubs that are born or the number of cubs that survive. You may start to see increases in mortality amongst younger bears, and that's a natural population process. And so the observation that was shared with me was that it's actually harvesting of polar bears actually can create healthy polar bear populations. And that's one of the things that kind of opened this door to me and said, wow, there's a wealth of information here. The biggest challenge, and this is something that I still struggle with, is how do you tap into that knowledge, and how can it be brought into the discussions that we're having today about core management and conservation of bears. I find that oftentimes the efforts or the attempts to tap into this knowledge, Inuit knowledge or traditional or ecological knowledge, are often centered around issues. And in other words, a study is done, a scientific study is done that raises controversy, and then a companion study is done on the local or traditional or Inuit knowledge or IQ. But the study is very driven by the issue that's being raised by the science. And I've often found those situations, it just doesn't work, because for a variety of reasons, partly because the objectives of the IQ study are often very narrow and very focused on generating knowledge that's relevant to the recent scientific study. And that I think that really limits the value of the knowledge that's acquired. I also think that oftentimes those studies are done in the atmosphere of political controversy, whether it's tension between government and core management boards or communities, and that I often wonder how that might impact the information that's shared and the way it's shared. So I've often found that those issue-driven studies are often not in my view particularly productive. The ones that I think are more productive are the ones that are sort of ongoing studies, efforts to collect IQ without a set of predefined questions. You may have topics and areas of interest, but I think if you try to be too directed in answering specific questions. In other words, if the study is premised on a set of specific questions that you want to answer, I find those types of studies often don't work very well. You need to have oftentimes the questions themselves come from the information you collect. In other words, so I think the best studies are the ones that are based on areas of interest, topics of interest, but not issues and not specific questions. I think that some of the most powerful information that comes out of these studies comes from when people are able to reach back in their memories and the memories that have been passed on to them and share stories. Some of the most striking information to me has come from people sharing stories and memories that are being passed on, and I think that one of the I mean, there are many values to this information, but one of the values that one of the valuable things about this IQ is the fact that its frame of reference is decades or many decades, at far greater than most of the scientific studies that we do. And if you can tap into that long term body of knowledge in order to examine trends in wildlife, trends in populations, and it's immensely valuable to be able to do that. You know, in the Nunatsiavut, for example, in talking with one individual, he was recounting to me stories from that were his own personal experiences, but they went back 50 years of traveling in the northern portions of the region up on the northern tip of Labrador, and stating that in those days it was completely unheard of to see polar bears in these areas, and that it was considered safe to camp. Everybody felt it was incredibly safe to camp. You wouldn't see polar bears. Yet now, go up into that region. I was there in 2018 doing a polar bear study. There are bears everywhere, and I wouldn't recommend anybody camp there. And so you know, that type of long-term frame of reference is immensely valuable. Many of the studies that have been done on specifically on Inuit knowledge and polar bears have been issue-driven. They've come after a scientific study has been done. I think one opportunity we have is to flip that around and to gather this knowledge and study it, and from that, and based on that, generate ideas for research that could then be done either with scientific methodologies or with biological science methodologies or social science methodologies. In other words, use the collected knowledge to actually set up research questions that could be answered by a variety of different techniques. Having worked in government and having written a lot of briefing notes relating to wildlife management decisions, and including polar bear management decisions, I think that one of the challenges for policy and decision makers is accessing this knowledge. It is in an easy form, something that is concise enough for a decision maker to access. For example, decision makers they like hard numbers. They like visual graphics, whether it's graphs or maps and things like that. When it comes to a lot of oftentimes the Inuit knowledge reports that are shared are quite thick. They're very text heavy, and it's hard for them to be integrated into the decision making process. It's certainly hard for a decision maker to have the time to review that type of report. I think one of the more powerful ways of bringing Inuit knowledge into policy and decision making is audio visually. There's no question about it. Through the making of short films that summarize the body of knowledge, that actually has individuals speaking on camera. I think that it's a much more powerful way to reach decision makers. If you are say a graduate student or a new graduate student, or you're planning to be one, and you're thinking about doing a research project, a master's or a PhD or anything like that, or even if you're a regional biologist working for a government, if you're thinking about your next piece of research, that the first thing you should do is sit down and make some effort to go and sit down and gather some knowledge, before you even write a proposal. Pick a topic or a theme, and go and discuss it, and find out what is out there on that particular topic, because that alone may help you generate your research questions. You have to go into it without any specific expectations about how much or what you'll get and how much you'll get. In other words, if you sit down with somebody, you have to remain very open to the fact that you may finish your conversation and just have this wealth of information that's being provided to you, or you may find that you didn't get much from that particular discussion, but when you go and have your next discussion, your next sit down, you may suddenly get a ton of information, or you may find that as you have more and more conversations that you originally thought were perhaps irrelevant to your interests or to your suddenly become extremely relevant, because you may hear the same points being made by individuals over and over again, and you realize, hey, this isn't just a one-off thing. There's actually something to this. There's an observation or a process that's being observed here that's being seen by multiple individuals. So there is really something to this.